The last pair of high heels clicked across the marble floor and disappeared through the heavy oak doors. A gust of cool autumn night air swirled into the lobby for a moment, carrying with it the fading sounds of laughter and car doors slamming. Before the doors swung shut again, sealing the silence inside, for the 300 people who had just left, the night was a success. They had eaten, they had drunk, they had clapped for the local politician and the mayor. And they had felt good about donating to a cause that sounded important on a Saturday night. For him, the night was just getting started. He was the man who cleaned up after the feeling good was over. He stood for a moment in the cavernous lobby, letting the quiet settle around him like dust. He was 38, though the lines around his eyes and the permanent slouch in his shoulders made him look a decade older. His uniform, a simple gray jumpsuit with the name of the community center stitched over the pocket, felt like a second skin. It was a skin of invisibility. During the event, people would see him clearing a plate or emptying a trash can, and their eyes would simply slide past him as if he were part of the architecture. He didn't mind. It was easier that way. He pushed his rolling cart forward, the squeak of its wheels the only sound breaking the stillness. The cart was his world, filled with trash bags, brooms, mops, and cleaning sprays that promised to erase any trace of the evening's fleeting joy. His first task was the main auditorium. The doors were propped open, and the scene inside was one of controlled chaos. Empty wine glasses stood like tiny, glittering soldiers on every table. White linen cloths were stained with the ghosts of dinners and the dark red splashes of spilled Merlot. Programs had been dropped and stepped on, their crisp pages now crumpled and sad. He started his work, moving with an efficiency that came from years of practice. His hands, rough and calloused from a life of physical labor, moved with a surprising gentleness. He gathered the glasses, the soft clinking a sad little melody against the silence. He collected the trash, tying off the black bags with a sharp, definitive pull. He was a ghost, methodically putting the world back in order. In the third row from the back, a small figure sat hunched over a book, the pages illuminated by the single exit sign above the door. It was his daughter. At 7 years old, she was an old soul, already accustomed to the rhythms of a life that didn't always follow a 9-to-5 schedule. While other children were home in bed, she often accompanied him on these late-night jobs. It was either that or be alone in their small apartment, and that was never an option. Not for him. She never complained. She would find a quiet corner, pull out a book from her worn backpack, build a world for herself among the chairs and shadows. Sometimes, if he was lucky, she would fall asleep, and he would carry her to the car, her small body a warm, solid weight in his arms that reminded him of everything he was fighting for. He worked his way down the aisles, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. The auditorium was designed to hold 1,000 people, and empty. It felt vast and holy, like a cathedral for a forgotten god. He could almost hear the echoes of the night's events, the forced applause, the hollow laughter, the politician's speech full of promises he knew would be forgotten by morning. He'd heard it all from the wings, standing in the darkness, his cart parked beside him. It was a world so different from his own, a world of sparkling dresses and easy smiles. He didn't belong in it, and he had no desire to. His world was the one after the party. Finally, all that was left on the main floor was the stage. He climbed the 3 steps, his work boots making a heavy thud on the wood. The stage was a mess of microphone cables, a forgotten bottle of water, and a scattering of sheet music. He began to coil the cables, his fingers moving deftly, and then he saw it. It stood alone in the center of the stage, bathed in the lonely glow of a single spotlight that the tech crew had forgotten to turn off. The grand piano. It was a magnificent thing, black and gleaming, its polished surface reflecting the single light like a pool of dark water. It looked like a sleeping beast, or maybe a king in exile, waiting on his empty throne. For most of the evening, it had been a centerpiece. It's a place where a well-dressed woman from the city had played pleasant, unobtrusive tunes that people could talk over. Now, it was just silent. So silent, it seemed to draw all the air in the room toward it. He paused, his hands full of thick black cable. He didn't know why, but the sight of the piano always hit him in a certain way. It was a punch to the gut, a sudden sharp memory of a life that felt a million years away. A life filled with music, a life with her. He could almost feel her presence beside him, smell the faint scent of lavender that always clung to her clothes. She had loved the piano. Their old, second-hand upright had been the heart of their small home. She had been the heart of their home. Now both were gone. He shook his head, as if to physically shake the memory away. He had a job to do. He finished coiling the cable and secured it with a Velcro strap. He picked up the trash, tossed the water bottle. He swept the stage with a wide broom head, the bristles scratching softly against the wood. He was trying to focus on the task, on the simple, physical act of cleaning. But the piano was right there. It was a magnet. He finished sweeping and stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. The silence of the auditorium was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. It was full of all the things he couldn't say. He thought about his daughter sitting in the dark. He thought about the rent that was due. He thought about the pile of bills on his kitchen table. He thought about the crushing, relentless weight of being the only one. The only parent, the only provider. The only one who remembered the sound of her laugh. It was all too much. It was a dam inside him, and the pressure was building to a point where he felt like he might burst. He looked down at his hands. They were cleaner's hands. Hands that knew the feel of a mop, the weight of a trash bag, the scrape of a broom. They weren't meant for anything beautiful. They weren't meant to touch something so perfect and elegant. But the urge was overwhelming. It wasn't a thought, really. It was a need, a deep, primal need to touch the keys, to see if they still felt the same. To hear if they still held a ghost of the sound she used to make, with a sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. He leaned the broom against the front of the stage. He walked over to the piano and stood before it, his shadow falling across the keys. The ivory looked cool and smooth, like ancient bone. He hesitated for only a second more. This was foolish. It was unprofessional. But he didn't care. He just needed something. He reached out, his rough fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before he gently lowered the padded bench. The small sigh of the leather was the only sound. He sat down. The jumpsuit felt scratchy and out of place against the smooth wood. He placed his hands on the keys, his calloused fingers looking foreign and clumsy against the pristine white. And in the quiet of the empty hall, under the gaze of a single spotlight, he began to play. The first note was a mistake. It was a hesitant, heavy thud that sounded more like a complaint than a chord. A clumsy knock on a door he wasn't sure he should be opening. It hung in the air, loud and awkward in the perfect silence of the auditorium. He flinched, pulling his hands back as if the keys had burned him. For a moment, he felt a flush of shame. What was he doing? He was a man in a cleaner's uniform, sitting at a concert grand piano in an empty hall, pretending to be something he wasn't. He was about to get up, to grab his broom and disappear back into the familiar shadows of his work. When he caught a glimpse of his daughter in the third row, she hadn't looked up from her book, but she knew he was there. Her stillness was a kind of permission. He wasn't just a custodian in that moment. He was her father. He took a breath, the air in the hall feeling thick and heavy in his lungs. He closed his eyes. This was the only way. He had to shut out the grandness of the room, the gleam of the piano, the reality of who he was now. He had to go back. He let his mind drift, past the long days and sleepless nights, past the funeral and the hospital, past the sickness and the fear, all the way back to a small, sun-drenched living room in a cramped apartment on the other side of town. He could see it so clearly. The afternoon light used to spill through the dusty window panes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden fairies. Their piano, an old upright they had bought for $50 from a thrift store, stood against the far wall. Its wood was scuffed, and its finish was worn in places where countless hands had rested. But to him, it was the most beautiful object in the world. It was where the magic happened. She would sit there, her back straight, her fingers dancing across the yellowed ivory, and the whole room would change. The cramped apartment would fall away, replaced by whatever world her music was building. Sometimes it was a soaring, hopeful melody that made him feel like they could conquer anything. Sometimes it was a quiet, mournful tune that felt like a gentle rain, washing away the worries of the day. He was never a musician. He was the listener, the audience. He would sit on their worn-out sofa, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, and just watch her. He loved the way her eyes would close when a particularly beautiful phrase took hold of her. It's the way a small, private smile would play on her lips. The music wasn't just sound to her. It was a conversation. It was a language she understood better than words. He would try to learn. He really would. He would sit beside her on the bench, his large, awkward hands trying to mimic the graceful arc of her fingers. He would stumble through the scales, his movements clumsy and heavy, and she would laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was the warm, genuine sound that had been the soundtrack to his entire adult life. "Oh, you," she would say, gently moving his hand to the correct position. "You're trying to muscle it. You have to let the notes come to you. You're too strong for your own good. You could never get it right." His fingers were used to gripping tools, to lifting things, to applying force. They didn't know how to be gentle, but he kept trying because it made her smile. He wanted to be a part of her world, even if he was just a clumsy visitor. There was one melody he had tried to write. It wasn't for anyone to hear but her. It was supposed to be for their anniversary, a surprise. He had worked on it for weeks, stealing moments while she was at work. He would peck out the notes, one by one, a clumsy, halting attempt to put a feeling into music. He wanted it to sound like how he felt when she walked into her room. It was supposed to sound like warmth, like safety, like coming home. But every time he played it, it sounded wrong. It was simple, almost childlike, and the transitions were clumsy. It sounded like what it was, the work of an amateur. He got so frustrated with it one day that he slammed the keyboard lid shut, the bang echoing in the small apartment. She had come rushing in, her face etched with concern. She had asked, "Nothing," he had mumbled, feeling foolish. "It's stupid." She had sat down beside him and opened the lid, her fingers gently tracing over the keys he had just abused. "Play it for me," she had said softly. He had shaken his head, embarrassed. "It's no good. It doesn't sound right." "Please," she had whispered, her hand finding his. "Anything you create is good to me." So he had played it, his face hot with shame. He fumbled through the melody, hitting wrong notes, rushing the tempo. When he finished, he kept his eyes down, waiting for her to politely tell him it was a nice try. But she was quiet for a long time. He finally looked up and saw that she had tears in her eyes. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she had said, her voice thick with emotion. "It sounds like you." He didn't understand then, not really. He just knew that she had taken his broken, clumsy melody and made it perfect. She had hummed it, her voice adding a richness and depth that his fingers could never find. She had played it back to him, and suddenly, it was everything he had wanted it to be. It was warm. It was safe. It was home. After that, it became their song, a secret language between them. The memory was so real, so vivid, that he could almost feel the sun on his face. He could almost hear her humming the melody. His fingers, which had been stiff and unsure on the keys, began to relax. The clumsy note he had struck at the beginning was forgotten. He was no longer a custodian in a uniform. He was a husband, sitting on a worn bench in a sunlit room. He wasn't performing. He was remembering. He started to play the melody again. It was slow at first, searching. The notes were still hesitant, but now they were connected by a thread of purpose. It was the same clumsy tune he had tried to write all those years ago, but something was different. The imperfections were still there, the slightly off-key notes, the awkward pauses between phrases, but they didn't sound like mistakes anymore. They sounded like hesitation. They sounded like vulnerability. They sounded like truth. His fingers, so used to the brute force of his daily work, were surprisingly light. They moved with a memory of their own, tracing the path she had shown him, the path she had hummed into existence. He wasn't thinking about the chords or the technique. He was just letting the feeling flow through him, from his heart, down his arms, and out through his fingertips. Each note was a word in a story he hadn't been able to tell anyone, a story about love and loss that was too big for words. The melody began to take shape. It was simple, yes, but it was also deep. It had the simple, honest beauty of a handmade gift. It was a conversation he was having with a ghost. He was asking her where she was. He was telling her how much he missed her. He was apologizing for all the things he hadn't said. He was remembering the way her hair caught the light, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of her hand in his dot. From the shadows of the third row, his daughter looked up from her book. She had heard that first wrong note, and it had made her curious. Now she recognized the music. She had heard her father play it before, on rare occasions late at night in their living room, when he thought she was asleep. It was a sound that was both incredibly sad and incredibly beautiful. It was the sound of her parents' love story. She closed her book quietly, her full attention on the solitary figure on the stage, bathed in the lonely glow of the spotlight. He didn't look like her dad, the man who made her pancakes and helped with her homework. He looked like a silhouette from a dream, a sad, beautiful story being told in the language of the quiet. Two of the event volunteers, a man and a woman who had been gathering their coats and leftover name tags in the lobby, stopped what they were doing. They stood in the doorway of the auditorium listening. They looked at each other, a question in their eyes. What was that sound? It wasn't the pleasant background music from the event. This was different. This was raw. It was personal. It felt like they were intruding on a private moment, but they couldn't bring themselves to leave. The music had a hold on them. It was pulling them in. The man, who was in his late 50s and had seen a lot in his life, felt a strange tightening in his chest. It sounded like heartache. It sounded like love. It sounded like life. They stood in the doorway, silent witnesses, as the simple melody continued to bloom in the vast, empty space. The custodian was no longer invisible. He had a voice, and it was leaving everyone who heard it completely and utterly speechless. The simple melody hung in the air of the auditorium, each note a tiny, shimmering thread connecting the past to the present. It was a sound that was both fragile and incredibly strong. For the man at the piano, the world outside the spotlight had ceased to exist. The rows of empty seats, the dusty curtains, the cart of cleaning supplies, they were all gone. There was only him, the keys, and the ghost of the woman he loved. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of concentration and grief, as if he were trying to sculpt the music from the very air around him. He was no longer just playing the notes he had written all those years ago. He was expanding on them, letting the melody breathe and grow. The music began to change, shifting its shape and tone. It was like watching a single cloud in a clear sky slowly gather other clouds to itself, growing darker and heavier, promising a storm. The initial hesitant sweetness of the melody was still there, the core of her humming, but now it was being surrounded by something else. A new layer of sound emerged, darker and more complex. It was the sound of the hospital, the low, constant hum of the machines, the hushed, urgent whispers of doctors in the hallway, the feeling of the too clean. Starched sheets in his hands as he sat by her bed watching her sleep, praying for a morning that would never be the same. His left hand, which had been playing simple, supportive chords, began to move with more intent. It started to play a low, rhythmic pattern, a heavy, persistent beat that felt like a heartbeat struggling against an overwhelming force. It was the sound of fear. It was the sound of trying to be strong when you feel like you are shattering into a million pieces. The melody from his right hand, the sound of her, became more fragmented now. It would soar for a moment, full of the hope and light he remembered, and then it would falter, stumbling over a discordant note, falling back into the somber rhythm of the bass. It was a musical depiction of hope and despair, waging a war on the keyboard. He wasn't thinking about technique. His fingers, usually so clumsy, were now possessed by a fury and a sorrow that were far more powerful than any muscle memory. A low, rumbling bass line began to grow, a sound so deep and resonant it seemed to shake the very floor of the auditorium. It was the sound of the earth opening up, of a foundation cracking. It was the sound of his world falling apart. And then the rain of notes began. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a torrent, a cascade of sound that came crashing down from the upper registers of the piano. These were not happy, tinkling notes. They were sharp, frantic, and filled with a desperate, chaotic energy. Each note was a drop of panic, a flash of anger, a question screamed into an empty void. Why? Why her? Why us? The music was no longer a memory. It was a confrontation. His body began to move with the music. His shoulders hunched forward, his head bowed low over the keys. He was no longer just sitting at the piano. He was locked in a battle with it. His hands flew across the keyboard, the sound growing in intensity and volume. It was the sound of a man who had held everything in for so long that the dam had finally broken. This was the grief he couldn't show his daughter. This was the rage he couldn't show the world. This was the storm that had been raging inside him for 2 years, finally given a voice. The beautiful, simple melody was still in there somewhere, a faint, desperate cry in the midst of the hurricane. But it was being battered and torn apart by the fury of the loss. In the doorway, the 2 volunteers stood transfixed. The woman had brought a hand up to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. The man stood with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed, his own painful memories stirring in response to the raw power of the music. They had come to clean up after a charity event, a night of polite society and scripted emotion. What they were witnessing now was the polar opposite. It was unfiltered, unapologetic, and brutally honest. They felt like intruders, but they were also captivated. The music was telling a story, and even without knowing the details, they understood every single word. The sound began to draw others back into the auditorium. A couple who had just reached their car in the parking lot heard the strange, powerful music drifting through the walls. They looked at each other, confused, and found themselves walking back toward the entrance, drawn by an invisible thread. The bartender, who was wiping down the last of the glasses, stopped and leaned against the bar, his head cocked to one side, a frown of concentration on his face. The security guard, a man who had seen thousands of events come and go, stood just inside the main doors, his usual bored expression replaced by one of deep, somber respect. A small, silent crowd was beginning to form. A congregation of witnesses gathered in the back and along the walls, drawn to the raw, human sound filling the vast space. From her seat in the 3rd row, the little girl watched her father. She had never seen him like this. She had seen him sad, of course. She had seen him quiet and tired. But she had never seen him pour out his soul quite like this. The music wasn't just sad to her. It was a story she knew by heart. She could hear her mother's laugh in the high, soaring notes. She could feel her father's hand holding hers in the steady, comforting rhythm of the bass. But she also heard the parts she didn't like to think about, the scary beeping sounds from the hospital, the long nights when their apartment felt too big and too empty. The music was all of it, all at once. It was the truth, and even though it made her heart ache, it was also beautiful. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just held onto her book and let the music wash over her, a small, steady anchor in her father's storm. The music on stage reached its peak. It was a wall of sound, a wave of emotion so intense it felt almost unbearable. The bass notes were like thunder, the high notes like lightning. It was the sound of a heart breaking in real time. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it started to change. The torrent of frantic notes began to slow, the chaos giving way to a more structured, yet still sorrowful, sound. The anger was fading, being replaced by a profound and bottomless well of sadness. It was the feeling that comes after the storm, when you look at the damage and realize the world is never going to be the same again. He began to play the melody again, the one he had written for her. But this time it was different. It was no longer the sweet, hopeful tune from the sunlit living room. It was a requiem. It was slower, fuller, and filled with a deep, resonant ache. Every note was weighted with the memory of what was lost. It was the sound of looking back at a perfect day and knowing you can never go back. It was the sound of saying goodbye. He played it with a tenderness that was heartbreaking, his touch both heavy and light, as if he were trying to hold something incredibly precious without breaking it. The small crowd in the hall was completely still. No one was checking their phone. No one was whispering to their neighbor. They were all united in the spell of the music, their own private griefs and losses resonating with the notes coming from the stage. The music was a mirror, and in it, they saw their own broken hearts reflected. Finally, the melody began to fade. He played it once more, his touch even lighter now, the notes becoming softer and more spaced apart, like the last flashes of a star before it disappears. It was a question hanging in the air, a final, desperate "I miss you." He let his fingers linger over the keys, and then with the last bit of strength he had, he played a single low chord. It wasn't a loud chord. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to settle into the floorboards and the very souls of the people listening. And then he let it fade. He held his foot on the sustain pedal, allowing the final note to hang in the air, a single, vibrating thread of sound connecting them all. He didn't move. His hands remained on the keys, his head still bowed. The silence that followed was more profound, more powerful, than any of the noise that had come before it. The music was over, but the feeling remained thick and palpable in the vast, empty hall. It was the sound of a soul laid bare, and it had left everyone who heard it utterly and completely speechless. The silence that followed the last lingering note was not an empty silence. It was a full, heavy silence, thick with a story that had just been told without a single word. The sound of the piano had vanished, but the feeling it left behind clung to the air, wrapping around the exposed beams and the velvet seats, seeping into the very foundation of the old building. It was a shared, sacred space, created by one man's grief, and now held by a small, accidental congregation. For a long moment, no one in the hall moved. The two volunteers in the doorway stood as if frozen, their breath caught in their chests. The couple who had returned from the parking lot stood near the back, their hands clasped tightly together. The unspoken decision to stay, now feeling like the most important choice they had made all night. The bartender leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the bar. His usual world of clinking glasses and easy chatter replaced by this profound, immersive quiet. Even the little girl in the third row remained perfectly still, her small book held loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed on the solitary, bowed figure on the stage. They had all heard it. It wasn't just music. It had been a journey. They had felt the hope, the fear, the rage, and the bottomless sorrow. They had been taken to a sunlit room and then plunged into a dark, stormy sea. The man at the piano had not performed for them. He had simply invited them, unawares, into the most private, painful corner of his own heart. And in doing so, he had touched something universal in each of them. The music had bypassed their ears and gone straight to their souls, stirring up their own memories of love and loss, their own quiet battles and private heartaches. In the shared stillness, there was a powerful, unspoken connection. A group of strangers, bound together by a single, beautiful, heartbreaking truth. The silence was finally broken by a sound from the stage. It was not another note. It was the soft, almost imperceptible sound of a deep, shuddering breath being released. The man at the piano had been holding himself rigid, every muscle tensed in the act of creation. Now, as the spell of the music broke, his body seemed to deflate. His shoulders, which had been hunched with the weight of his story, slumped forward. His head, which had been bowed in concentration, dropped lower, his forehead nearly touching the cool ivory keys. He looked smaller now, almost fragile in the single spotlight. The giant who had waged a war on the piano was gone, leaving behind only a tired, broken man. Slowly, as if waking from a long and painful dream, he lifted his head. His eyes, still moist, blinked against the bright light. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, as if he didn't know where he was. Then his gaze shifted from the piano keys to the auditorium, and he saw them. His eyes widened. A look of pure, undiluted shock crossed his face, followed quickly by a hot wave of embarrassment. His breath hitched in his throat. People. There were people in the hall. Not just one or two. A crowd. They were standing in the aisles, clustered by the doors, watching him. His face, which had been an open book of emotion just moments before, became a mask of panic. He felt a flush creep up his neck, a burning heat of shame that was far more painful than any grief. He had been caught. He had been seen. The walls he had so carefully built around his private world had been torn down. Not by his own hands, but by the very act of trying to heal. He hadn't meant for anyone to hear. This was his secret, his shame, his sacred ritual. Now, it belonged to them. He quickly pulled his hands back from the keys as if they were hot coals, wiping them nervously on the thighs of his gray work jumpsuit. The rough fabric of the uniform suddenly felt like a coarse, scratchy reminder of his place. He was the custodian, the man who cleaned up the messes. He was not the man who belonged on a stage pouring his heart out. He felt exposed, foolish, and deeply, deeply ashamed. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the floorboards and into the darkness beneath the stage. The private catharsis had become a public spectacle, and the horror of it was suffocating. He stood up abruptly, the small bench scraping against the stage floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. He couldn't look at them. He couldn't bear to see the pity in their eyes, or worse, the confusion. He just wanted to get back to his cart, to grab his broom, to become invisible again. He started to walk toward the edge of the stage, his movements stiff and awkward. He was a man trying to pretend that the most vulnerable moment of his life had never happened. But as he turned to leave, sound began to ripple through the silent crowd. It started with the elderly security guard standing by the main doors. He was a man who had seen countless performances, from polished professionals to fumbling beginners, but nothing had ever moved him like this. He slowly raised his hands, bringing them together in a single, soft clap. It wasn't a loud, commanding sound. It was gentle, reverent, a sound of deep, heartfelt respect. The woman in the doorway, seeing the guard's gesture, joined in. Then her partner. Then the couple from the parking lot. One by one, the scattered onlookers began to applaud. It wasn't the boisterous, obligatory applause you hear after a scheduled performance. This was different. It grew slowly, organically, a wave of soft, thunderous understanding that washed over the hall. The sound was not a celebration of talent. It was an acknowledgement of pain. It was a collective embrace, a silent way of saying, "We see you. We hear you. You are not alone." The man stopped in his tracks, his back still to the audience. He was stunned by the sound. He had expected pity, or maybe just awkward silence as they filed out. He had not expected this. This sound wasn't for him, the performer. It was for him, the human. He had offered them his brokenness, and they were offering him their compassion in return. He stood there for a long moment, the sound washing over him, and he felt something inside him begin to shift. The hot shame started to cool, replaced by a warm, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen. Tessa and not being found wanting. He couldn't bring himself to turn around and bow. That would be accepting a role he didn't feel he had played. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the back of the hall. It was a gesture of immense, quiet gratitude, a simple thank you for the gift of their witness. Then he stepped off the stage, the thud of his work boots on the floor, a grounding, solid sound. He didn't look at anyone as he walked down the aisle. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the small figure waiting for him in the third row. He reached his daughter and knelt down in front of her, so they were face to face. The applause in the hall was still going, a gentle, persistent rain of sound. He looked into her eyes, expecting to see confusion or fear, but all he saw was a deep, knowing sadness, to love so pure it made his heart ache. She didn't ask him any questions. She didn't need to. She simply reached out her small hand and placed it on his cheek. Her touch was cool and gentle. In that simple gesture, she was telling him that it was okay, that she understood, that she loved him no matter what. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch. It was an anchor in the storm of his emotions. He had poured out his grief for his wife, and in return, he had received the unwavering love of his daughter. He felt a single tear escape and trace a path down his own cheek, a twin to the one she had shed earlier. He didn't wipe it away. He took her small hand in his large, calloused one. "Time to go, sweetie," he said, his voice husky and thick. She simply nodded, closing her book and sliding it into her backpack. Together, they walked up the aisle, a solitary father and his small, wise daughter, leaving the sound of empathy behind them. They walked past the volunteers, past the bartender, past the silent crowd who parted for them like a sea. No one said a word. They just watched them go, their faces filled with a profound respect for the man who had been brave enough to share his brokenness, and for the little girl who held him together as they pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of the applause followed them for a moment before the doors swung shut, sealing the story inside. They walked hand in hand toward their old, reliable car, a world of unspoken understanding passing between them. The night was not over. He still had to get her home, tuck her into bed, and face another day. But something had changed. The weight he carried on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. The dam inside him had broken, but he hadn't been swept away. He had been held afloat by the quiet, unexpected kindness of strangers and the steady, unwavering love of the only family he had left. The heavy oak doors of the community center swung shut, and with them, the sound of the applause was finally cut off. The sudden quiet of the parking lot was jarring. It was just the sound of the wind rustling the dry leaves on the asphalt and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. The man stood there for a moment, his hand still holding his daughter's, letting the cool night air seep into his jumpsuit. The world outside felt sharp and real, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warm, emotional fog he had just been in. He felt drained, hollowed out, like a log that had been burned from the inside out. Every muscle in his body ached, not from physical labor, but from the sheer force of what had just happened. He looked down at his daughter. She was looking up at him, her small face solemn in the dim light from the parking lot lamps. She hadn't said a word since they left the auditorium, but he didn't need her to. Her silence was not the silence of a confused child. It was the deep, knowing quiet of someone who had understood everything. She squeezed his hand, a small, firm pressure that was more grounding than anything he had ever felt. He squeezed back gently, a silent promise passing between them. "Everything is okay. We are okay." He led her to their car, an old, sensible sedan that had seen better days. It was a reliable, unremarkable car, much like himself. It didn't draw attention. It just did its job. He unlocked the doors, and the interior light flickered on, illuminating the worn seats and the faint smell of old coffee and the fast food fries they sometimes shared as a special treat. He helped her into the back seat, making sure she was buckled in securely, his hands moving with the familiar, automatic motions of a parent. It was these small, everyday rituals that kept him anchored. It was the act of making sure her seatbelt was clicked in just right, of knowing she was safe, that gave his life its structure and purpose. He got into the driver's seat and closed the door. The familiar thud, a welcome sound. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, just looking out into the darkness of the parking lot. The engine was off, and the car was a small, quiet bubble in the vastness of the night. He could feel his daughter's eyes on him from the back seat. He wanted to say something. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to make sure she wasn't scared, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain a hurricane to a child who has already lived through it? How do you apologize for a wound that you both share, Dad? Her small voice finally broke the silence. He turned his head to look at her. "Yes, sweetie. Was that Mom's song?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He felt a fresh wave of emotion, a gentle tide this time, not a storm. He had forgotten, in his own turmoil, that the music was her memory too. It wasn't just his story. It was their story. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "That was Mom's song. It was pretty," she said simply. "But it was sad." Took a deep breath, the air catching in his chest. "Yeah, it's a sad song now." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Did you feel better after you played it?" He thought about the question. Did he feel better? He didn't feel happy. He didn't feel cured. The grief was still there, a heavy, permanent resident in his heart. But the crushing, suffocating pressure that had been building for 2 years had lessened. The shame he felt, the sense that his grief was a weakness he had to hide, was gone. It had been seen, and it had been met not with judgment, but with kindness. It's not about feeling better, he said, trying to find the right words. Sometimes. Sometimes you just have to let the sad out, so it doesn't get too heavy. She seemed to understand this. She nodded, her small face serious. Like when I cry about my goldfish. He felt a small, sad smile touch his lips. Yeah, just like that. He turned back to the front and started the car. The engine rumbled to life, a steady, dependable sound. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty street. The drive home was quiet. The street lights cast a warm, moving glow across the inside of the car. He didn't turn on the radio. He just drove his daughter, a quiet, solid presence behind him. He thought about the faces of the people in the audience. He had seen them not as a threat, but as fellow travelers. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone in his sorrow. He had shared it, and it had not broken him. In fact, it had, in some small way, made him feel more whole. When they got back to their small apartment, the routine of the evening took over. He made her a small glass of warm milk. He listened to her tell him about the book she was reading, her voice full of excitement about a brave mouse on an adventure. He brushed her teeth, the foamy mint, a familiar, mundane scent. He tucked her into bed, pulling the worn quilt up to her chin. He kissed her forehead, her skin warm and soft. "Dad?" she asked, as he was about to turn off her bedside lamp. "Yes. Can you play that song for me sometimes? Not the sad part, just the beginning." He looked at her, his heart swelling with a love so powerful it almost hurt. She wasn't afraid of the sadness. She just wanted to remember the good part, too. "Of course, sweetie," he said, his voice soft. "Whenever you want." He turned off the lamp, and her room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a star. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep, her breathing slow and even. The apartment was quiet, but it wasn't the empty, lonely quiet he was used to. It felt peaceful. It felt full. He walked into the living room and sank down onto the sofa. It was the same sofa where he used to sit and watch her play. The old upright piano was gone, sold in a desperate moment months ago to pay for a medical bill. But as he sat there, he could still hear the music. He could still feel the vibrations of the keys under his fingers. He thought about the custodian uniform he had left in a pile by the door. He would have to put it on again tomorrow. He would have to go back to being invisible, to cleaning up the messes of other people's lives. But he knew he wasn't the same man who had walked into the community center that evening. That man had been a ghost, carrying his grief in secret. The man who sat on the sofa now had shared his ghost story with the world, and the world had been kind. He leaned his head back against the cushions and closed his eyes. He didn't know what the future held. The bills were still real. The loneliness would still creep in on the long nights. The sadness was a part of him now, a scar tissue over a wound that would never fully heal. But for the first time, he understood that the wound didn't have to be a source of shame. It could be a source of connection. The broken places in him were the places where the light had gotten in tonight. The next morning, he woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light across the city. He made coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. His daughter came into the room, rubbing her eyes, her hair a messy halo around her head. She came and stood beside him, leaning her head against his leg. He put his hand on her head, his fingers gently combing through her hair. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching the new day begin, a quiet, unspoken understanding passing between them. Later that day, he was back at the community center. He was in his gray jumpsuit, pushing his cart down a quiet hallway. He passed the auditorium, the doors now closed. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the handle. He felt no anxiety, no embarrassment. He just felt a sense of peace. He had left a piece of his soul in that room last night, and in return, he had received a gift he never knew he needed. The gift of being heard. He let go of the door handle and continued down the hall, the squeak of his cartwheels echoing softly behind him. He was just a single dad, a custodian, a man doing his best. But he was also a man who had faced his deepest pain and found not just an audience, but a community. He was a man who had played his broken heart for a room full of strangers and had left them, and himself, speechless. And in that silence, he had found a new kind of song, one of quiet strength, of resilience, and of the profound, unbreakable bond of love. The world hadn't changed, but his place in it felt a little bit more solid, a little bit more seen, and for him, that was everything.